The train's whistle pierced the autumn air like a cry of desperation, steam billowing white against the orange Kansas sky. Inside the cramped passenger car, Margaret Sullivan pressed her palm against the cool window glass, watching endless wheat fields blur past in golden waves. Her reflection stared back, a woman of 26, with auburn hair pinned beneath a modest blue bonnet, green eyes bright with equal parts hope and terror. In her lap lay a crumpled letter, ink faded from countless readings. "Dear Miss Sullivan," it began in careful script, "I am in need of a wife to help raise my children and manage my homestead. If you are willing to begin a new life in Millfield, Kansas, I promise you will be treated with respect and kindness. Yours truly, Thomas Brennan." That letter had arrived 6 months ago in the crowded Boston boarding house where Margaret worked 16-hour days washing linens for pennies. Now, as the train shuddered to a halt at a weathered platform marked Millfield, she clutched her single carpet bag and stepped into an uncertain future. The platform was nearly empty except for a grizzled station master and an elderly woman in black, who eyed Margaret with obvious disapproval. Margaret smoothed her worn traveling dress, her best and only good outfit, and searched the sparse crowd for the face she'd memorized from a single photograph. Thomas Brennan. Tall, serious-looking, with kind eyes and work-hardened hands, he was nowhere to be seen. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. "Miss Sullivan?" The voice belonged to Pastor Williams, a thin man with gentle eyes who approached with hat in hand. Something in his expression made Margaret's stomach lurch. "I'm afraid I have difficult news to share." The walk to the small white church felt endless. Margaret's heels clicked against wooden sidewalks as curious townspeople peered from shop windows. Millfield was smaller than she'd imagined, barely more than a main street lined with a general store, blacksmith shop, and saloon. Beyond the town's edge, vast prairies stretched toward a horizon that seemed to swallow the sky. Pastor Williams ushered her into his modest office behind the sanctuary. The smell of old wood and candle wax filled the air as he gestured for her to sit in a worn chair. His hands trembled slightly as he poured water from a pitcher into a ceramic cup. "Miss Sullivan, I'm deeply sorry to tell you that Thomas Brennan passed away 3 weeks ago." The words hit like a physical blow. Margaret's carefully constructed future crumbled in an instant. She had sold everything she owned for the train ticket west. There was no money to return to Boston, no job waiting, no family to take her in. "How?" she managed to whisper. A tree fell while he was clearing land for winter firewood. Death was immediate. Pastor Williams' voice carried genuine sorrow. "Thomas was a good man, well respected in our community. His passing has been a tremendous loss." Margaret stared at her hands, fighting back tears. She had never met Thomas Brennan, but she had built dreams around his letters. He had written of his farm, his hopes for the future, his need for partnership in building something meaningful. Now those dreams lay as shattered as autumn leaves. "I understand this puts you in a terrible position," the pastor continued. "I've taken the liberty of speaking with some families in town who might need household help." "What about his children?" Margaret interrupted. "In his letters, he mentioned children." Pastor Williams's expression grew even more troubled. "That's complicated. Thomas had taken in 7 children over the years. Orphans, mostly, or children whose families couldn't care for them. They're currently staying at the farm, but the situation is difficult." "What do you mean, difficult?" The pastor stood and walked to the window, his back to Margaret. "Thomas left no will. The bank holds the mortgage on his property. Without someone to work the land and make payments, they'll foreclose within months. The children will be sent to various relatives or orphanages across the state. They'll be separated." Margaret felt something stir in her chest, not quite hope, but something stronger than despair. "These children, how old are they?" "The eldest is Benjamin, age 15. Then there's Emma at 13, twins Michael and Matthew at 11, little Sarah who's 8, Daniel at 6, and baby Ruth who just turned 3. Pastor Williams turned back to face her. "Miss Sullivan, I must be honest. These aren't easy children. They've known loss, hardship, abandonment. Benjamin has been trying to hold everything together, but he's just a boy himself. Emma hasn't spoken a word since Thomas died. The younger ones cry constantly. Through the church window, Margaret could see the sun beginning its descent toward the horizon. Somewhere beyond those rolling hills was a farmhouse filled with children who had lost the only father figure they'd known. 7 young souls facing separation and an uncertain future. "I want to see them," she said quietly. Pastor Williams looked surprised. "Miss Sullivan, I appreciate your compassion, but you must understand. You came here expecting to marry Thomas and build a life. These children represent years of commitment, sacrifice, hardship. They need more than temporary sympathy." Margaret stood, smoothing her skirts with hands that had stopped trembling. Something had shifted inside her during the pastor's description of those 7 children. Perhaps it was the memory of her own childhood in a Boston orphanage, or the years of loneliness that had driven her to answer Thomas's advertisement in the first place. Whatever it was, felt like purpose crystallizing from chaos. "Pastor Williams, I didn't travel 1,000 miles to turn back at the first sign of difficulty. Those children have already lost Thomas. They shouldn't lose their home too." The pastor studied her face carefully. "The farm is a hard place, Miss Sullivan. The house needs repairs, the harvest is only half gathered, and winter comes early in Kansas. Thomas was struggling to manage everything even before his accident. Then they need help more than ever, and you believe you can provide that help?" His tone wasn't unkind, but it carried the weight of practical concern. "Forgive my bluntness, but you're a young woman alone, with no farming experience, no family support, and no legal claim to the property." Margaret felt the truth of his words like stones in her chest. She had been a laundress and chambermaid, skilled with needle and thread, but ignorant of crops and livestock. Her hands were soft compared to the calloused palms of farm wives. She had never managed a household larger than herself, let alone 7 grieving children, but she had survived 26 years of uncertainty, had scraped together hope from nothing more than a stranger's letters. If Thomas Brennan had seen something in those children worth protecting, worth building a life around, perhaps she could see it too. "No," she said finally. "I don't know if I can provide what they need, but I know what it feels like to be alone, to face an uncertain future with no one to depend on. I won't let those children experience that if there's any way to prevent it." Pastor Williams was quiet for a long moment, studying her with the careful attention of a man accustomed to measuring the strength of human character. Finally, he reached for his coat, hanging on a wooden peg. "Very well, Miss Sullivan. I'll take you to the Brennan farm, but I want you to see exactly what you're considering before you make any promises. Those children have been disappointed too many times already." The ride to the farm took 30 minutes in Pastor Williams's modest wagon. They traveled along a dirt road that wound through rolling prairie, dotted with oak groves already turned brilliant red and gold. The air carried the sweet scent of ripening grain and the earthy smell of approaching autumn. As they crested a low hill, Margaret saw the Brennan property spread before them. The farmhouse was larger than she'd expected. A 2-story frame building with a wide porch and several outbuildings scattered around a central yard. Cornfields stretched away on 3 sides, the stalks tall and heavy with ears, ready for harvest. But even from a distance, she could see signs of neglect. Fence rails hung loose, the barn door stood askew, and weeds had begun to claim the vegetable garden near the house. A thin line of smoke rose from the chimney, the only sign of life in the fading daylight. "Thomas built that house with his own hands," Pastor Williams said as they approached. "It took him 3 years to finish it properly. He was proud of what he'd accomplished here." They pulled up to the front gate just as the house's front door opened. A tall, lanky boy emerged onto the porch. "Benjamin," Margaret realized. Even in the dim light, she could see the weight of premature responsibility in his shoulders, the careful way he watched their approach. Behind him appeared a girl with long brown braids, Emma, the 13-year-old who hadn't spoken since Thomas's death. Several smaller faces peered around the doorframe, eyes wide with curiosity and wariness. Pastor Williams helped Margaret down from the wagon, and together they walked toward the house. Benjamin descended the porch steps to meet them, his young face set in serious lines that belonged on someone much older. "Evening, Pastor Williams," he said, his voice carefully controlled. "We weren't expecting visitors. Benjamin, I'd like you to meet Miss Margaret Sullivan. She came to Millfield to marry your father." The boy's composure cracked slightly. His eyes darted to Margaret, taking in her travel-worn dress and uncertain expression. Behind him, she heard one of the smaller children whisper something to another. "I'm very sorry for your loss," Margaret said gently. "Pastor Williams has told me about Thomas's accident. I can't imagine how difficult this has been for all of you." Benjamin's jaw tightened. At 15, he was trying to be the man of the house, but Margaret could see the frightened boy beneath the facade. "We're managing fine on our own, I'm sure you are." Margaret's voice carried no condescension, only respect for what he'd been trying to accomplish. "But managing and thriving aren't the same thing. I wonder if you might show me around the farm. I'd like to understand what Thomas built here." Something in her tone, perhaps the fact that she'd spoken of Thomas with genuine interest rather than pity, seemed to soften Benjamin's defensive stance. He glanced at Pastor Williams, who nodded encouragingly. "I suppose that would be all right," Benjamin said. "Emma, take the little ones inside and get them ready for supper." As they toured the property in the gathering dusk, Margaret began to understand both the potential and the problems of the Brennan farm. Thomas had indeed built something remarkable: rich soil, good water access, sturdy buildings, and fields that could support a large family if properly managed. But she also saw what 3 weeks without adult supervision had cost. Crops stood ready for harvest, while the children struggled to keep up with basic daily needs. Livestock wandered loose because fence repairs had been deferred. The overwhelming nature of the work was evident in Benjamin's tired eyes and the younger children's increasingly wild behavior. By the time they returned to the house, full darkness had fallen. Through the windows, Margaret could see the warm glow of lamplight and hear the murmur of children's voices. For a moment, she imagined Thomas Brennan sitting at the head of a large table. 7 faces turned toward him with trust and affection. Now those same children faced an uncertain future, their security as fragile as October frost. Pastor Williams cleared his throat. "Miss Sullivan, I believe you've seen enough for one evening. We should return to town so you can consider your options properly." Margaret nodded, but her eyes remained fixed on the farmhouse windows. Somewhere inside, 7 children were trying to create normalcy from the wreckage of their world. Tomorrow would bring the same struggles as today, and the day after that, until eventually the bank's deadline arrived and everything Thomas had built would be scattered to the winds, unless someone chose to stand in the gap. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Margaret returned to town that night with her mind churning like a mill wheel. Pastor Williams had arranged for her to stay in the church's modest guest room, a small space behind the sanctuary that missionaries used when passing through Millfield. As she lay on the narrow cot, listening to prairie wind rattle the windows, sleep proved impossible. Dawn arrived grey and cold, with the sharp bite of approaching winter in the air. Margaret dressed quickly and walked to the general store, where she hoped to learn more about the Brennan family's situation. The proprietor, a stocky man named Jeremiah Walsh, greeted her with curious politeness. "You must be the lady who came to marry Thomas Brennan," he said, measuring flour into a cloth sack. "Terrible business his passing. Those children have been through more than their share of heartache. Pastor Williams mentioned they're orphans." Walsh nodded grimly. Thomas had a gift for taking in strays. Benjamin and Emma came first. Their parents died of cholera when they were just little ones. The twins, Michael and Matthew, were left on his doorstep one winter night, nearly frozen. Sarah's mother died in childbirth. Father couldn't care for her. Daniel was abandoned by relatives who couldn't feed another mouth. And little Ruth, he shook his head. Her whole family perished in a house fire. Thomas found her sitting in the ashes, crying for her mama. Margaret felt her chest tighten with each tragic story. 7 children, each carrying wounds that ran deeper than the loss of Thomas Brennan. They had found safety with him, and now that refuge was crumbling. The bank's been patient so far, Walsh continued, lowering his voice. But patience doesn't pay mortgages. Thomas was behind on payments even before the accident. Eugene Hartwell down at First National says they'll foreclose by Christmas if nobody steps forward. What happens to the children then? Scattered to the 4 winds. Benjamin's old enough to work, might find employment somewhere. Emma could become a housemaid if someone takes pity. The little ones, Walsh's expression darkened. Orphanages are already overcrowded. Some might end up in poorhouses or worse. The bell above the store's door chimed, and a tall woman in an expensive burgundy dress entered. Her blonde hair was perfectly arranged beneath a feathered hat, and her keen blue eyes surveyed the store with obvious disdain. "Mr. Walsh," she said in clipped tones, "I trust you have my order prepared?" "Of course, Mrs. Garrison, right here behind the counter." Walsh hurried to gather several packages wrapped in brown paper. Margaret noticed how his demeanor shifted, more deferential, almost nervous. "And you must be the unfortunate young woman who came to marry poor Thomas," Mrs. Garrison said, turning her attention to Margaret with calculating eyes. "Victoria Garrison. My husband owns the largest ranch in 3 counties. Margaret inclined her head politely. "Margaret Sullivan. Pleased to meet you. I imagine this situation has been quite shocking. To travel so far only to find—" Victoria made a dismissive gesture. "Well, I suppose you'll be returning east as soon as arrangements can be made. Actually, I'm considering staying to help with the children." Victoria's perfectly shaped eyebrows rose. "Help? My dear girl, those children are beyond help. 7 wild creatures running loose on a failing farm. It's a recipe for disaster." "They're grieving children who've lost their father figure," Margaret replied, keeping her voice steady despite the woman's condescending tone. "Father figure?" Victoria laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Thomas Brennan was a foolish man with a soft heart, collecting strays like some kind of charitable institution. Now look where it's led, an unmarried woman thinking she can play house with 7 troubled children." Margaret felt her Irish temper beginning to rise, but she forced herself to remain calm. "I believe every child deserves a chance at family." "Family." Victoria's voice sharpened. "Let me tell you about those children, Miss Sullivan. Benjamin is sullen and defiant. He once threw rocks at my carriage when it passed too close to their property. Emma hasn't spoken a word to anyone in weeks. The twins are destructive little savages who've been caught stealing apples from my orchard. And the younger ones," she shuddered delicately, "wild as animals." "They're traumatized children," Margaret said firmly. "Not criminals." Victoria studied her with cold calculation. "You seem determined to make a mistake, Miss Sullivan. But since you're so concerned about their welfare, you should know that I've made an offer to Pastor Williams. I'm prepared to take in 3 of the children, the younger ones, who might still be trained properly. The older ones are too set in their ways." Margaret's blood chilled. "Take them in how?" "As household staff, naturally. They'll have food, shelter, and learn valuable skills. Sarah and Daniel are young enough to be molded into proper servants. Little Ruth could be trained as a nursemaid when my own children arrive." The casual way Victoria discussed turning grieving children into servants made Margaret's stomach turn. "And the others?" "The older ones will have to fend for themselves. Benjamin and Emma are practically adults anyway. The twins," Victoria shrugged. "Perhaps someone needs farm hands. You want to separate them. Sentiment won't put food on the table, Miss Sullivan. These children need structure, discipline, purpose." Thomas filled their heads with nonsense about belonging and family. "The real world requires harder lessons." Margaret watched Victoria collect her packages and glide toward the door. Just before leaving, the woman turned back with a smile that never reached her eyes. "I'll give you 1 week to come to your senses, Miss Sullivan. After that, I'll assume you've abandoned any claim to those children, and I'll proceed with arrangements for the younger ones. It would be cruel to leave them in uncertainty any longer than necessary." The door chimed shut behind her, leaving Margaret and Mr. Walsh in heavy silence. "Don't mind Victoria Garrison," Walsh said quietly. "She's always been calculating. But she's not wrong about one thing. Those children do need stability, and fast." Margaret walked back to the church in a daze. Victoria Garrison's offer kept echoing in her mind. 3 children torn from their siblings, trained as servants, their childhood sacrificed to the convenience of adults. Benjamin and Emma left to survive on their own at 15 and 13. The twins separated and sent away. Pastor Williams found her sitting in the front pew, staring at the simple wooden cross above the altar. "You look troubled." "Miss Sullivan, Mrs. Garrison paid me a visit." The pastor's expression grew grim. "I see, she told you about her offer. You're considering it?" Pastor Williams sat beside her, his weathered hands folded in his lap. "Miss Sullivan, I've been ministering to this community for 20 years. I've seen what happens to orphaned children when they have nowhere to go. Victoria's proposal isn't ideal, but it would keep some of them fed and housed. As servants, separated from their siblings. Yes." His voice carried the weight of painful compromise. "But the alternative might be worse. If the farm is foreclosed and no one steps forward, all 7 children could end up in institutions hundreds of miles apart. At least Victoria's offer keeps 3 of them nearby." Margaret felt the walls of impossible choice closing in around her. She had arrived in Millfield with nothing but hope and $53 in her purse. What could she possibly offer 7 traumatized children that would compare to the security of the Garrison Ranch? However flawed. "Pastor, what did Thomas see in those children that made him keep taking them in?" The older man was quiet for a long moment. "Thomas lost his first wife and baby in childbirth. I think he saw those children as his chance to build the family he'd always wanted. He believed every child deserved to know they belonged somewhere. And now they're about to learn they don't belong anywhere unless someone proves otherwise." Margaret stood and walked to the window, overlooking Millfield's main street. In the distance, she could see the road that led to the Brennan farm, where 7 children were trying to hold together the fragments of their world. The logical choice was clear. Return to Boston, find work, rebuild her own life. Let Pastor Williams arrange whatever seemed best for the children. Victoria Garrison's offer, however cold, was more than most orphans could expect. But logic had never been Margaret's strongest trait. Logic would have kept her in the Boston boarding house, washing other people's linens until her hands cracked and her back bent with premature age. Logic wouldn't have answered a stranger's advertisement and traveled 1,000 miles on faith alone. "Pastor Williams," she said, turning from the window, "I need to ask you something, and I want an honest answer." "Of course. Do you believe it's possible for one woman to save that farm and raise those children properly?" The pastor studied her face carefully. "Possible, perhaps, probable? I'd be lying if I said yes. The challenges are enormous, Miss Sullivan. Financial, practical, emotional. Those children have been hurt deeply. Trust doesn't come easily to them anymore. But you think Thomas would have wanted someone to try?" A small smile crossed the pastor's weathered features. "Thomas once told me that faith wasn't about knowing you could succeed. It was about believing something was worth attempting, even when success seemed impossible." Margaret felt something crystallize in her chest, not confidence but determination. She thought of Benjamin trying to be a man at 15, of Emma's silent grief, of little Ruth growing up to be someone's nursemaid instead of someone's beloved daughter. "I want to speak with the children," she said, "all of them together. Before any decisions are made about their future, they deserve to have a voice in it." Pastor Williams looked surprised. "Miss Sullivan, children that age aren't equipped to make such momentous decisions. No, but they're equipped to say whether they want to be separated from each other. They're equipped to say whether they want to fight for their home or surrender it." Margaret's voice grew stronger with each word. "Those children have been treated like baggage to be distributed. It's time someone asked them what they want." The afternoon sky was heavy with clouds when Margaret and Pastor Williams arrived at the Brennan farm. This time Margaret came prepared. She had purchased basic supplies at Walsh's store: flour, salt, dried beans, and sugar. Small offerings, but gestures of goodwill. Benjamin met them at the door again, his young face etched with wariness. Behind him, the other children clustered in the hallway, their eyes wide with curiosity and fear. "Benjamin," Margaret said gently, "I'd like to speak with all of you, if that's all right. About your future and what choices you might have." The boy's jaw tightened. "Choices? People like us don't get choices, Miss Sullivan. We get told where to go and what to do. Maybe that's been true before," Margaret replied. "But it doesn't have to be true now." They gathered in the farmhouse's main room, a comfortable space with handmade furniture and a large stone fireplace. Margaret could see Thomas Brennan's care in every detail: the solid table that could seat a large family, the rocking chair by the window, the shelves lined with books. The children arranged themselves defensively. Benjamin stood with arms crossed. Emma sat silent and pale. The twins flanked each other like soldiers. Little Sarah clutched a worn rag doll. Daniel sucked his thumb despite his 6 years. And Ruth climbed onto Emma's lap. "I know you don't know me," Margaret began, settling into a chair where she could see all their faces. "And I know you have no reason to trust another adult who makes promises. But I want to tell you the truth about what's happening, and I want to hear what you think about it." She explained the bank's deadline, Victoria Garrison's offer, and the likelihood that they would be separated if no other solution could be found. She watched their faces as understanding dawned. Benjamin's anger, Emma's silent tears, the twins' fierce whispered conversation. When she finished, the room fell silent, except for the ticking of the mantel clock Thomas had built with his own hands. Finally, Benjamin spoke, his voice tight with controlled emotion. "So we're getting split up no matter what?" "Not necessarily," Margaret said carefully. "There is another option. I could stay and try to save the farm, try to keep you all together." "You?" Benjamin's voice cracked with desperate hope, quickly masked by skepticism. "You don't know anything about farming. You don't know us. Why would you want to take on something like this?" Margaret met his eyes steadily. "Because I know what it feels like to be alone in the world. Because I believe Thomas was right. Every child deserves to know they belong somewhere. And because looking at all of you, I see a family worth fighting for." Little Sarah spoke up in a whisper. "Would you really be our mama?" The question hit Margaret like a physical blow. 7 pairs of eyes watched her, waiting for an answer that would determine the shape of their entire future. Margaret Sullivan had come to Kansas to marry a stranger and build a conventional life. Instead, she found herself facing the most important decision she would ever make. Sarah's innocent question hung in the air like morning mist, fragile and transformative. Margaret looked into the child's hopeful eyes and felt something fundamental shift inside her chest. The careful plans she'd made, the reasonable doubts that had plagued her, all of it dissolved in the face of 7 children who needed someone to choose them. "Yes," Margaret said quietly, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was promising. "If you'll have me, I would be honored to be your mama." The effect was immediate and electric. Ruth clapped her small hands together. Daniel stopped sucking his thumb, and even the skeptical twins exchanged meaningful glances. But it was Emma's reaction that moved Margaret most. The silent girl lifted her head for the first time, tears streaming down her face, and whispered a single word. "Really, really," Margaret confirmed, rising from her chair to kneel before Emma and Ruth. "But I need you all to understand something. This won't be easy. I don't know much about farming, and I've never raised children before. We'll have to learn together, and there will be times when we struggle." Benjamin stepped forward, his 15-year-old shoulders straightening with sudden purpose. "What do you need us to do?" The directness of his question surprised her. This boy had been carrying impossible weight, trying to be both brother and father to 6 siblings. Now he was offering to shoulder whatever burden came next. "First, we need to make this legal," Margaret said, thinking quickly. "Pastor Williams, what would it take for me to formally adopt these children and assume responsibility for the farm's debts?" The pastor looked stunned. Miss Sullivan, adoption requires significant legal processes. You'd need to establish residency, prove financial capability, undergo investigations by county officials. How long would that take? Months, possibly longer. And there's no guarantee. We don't have months, Benjamin interrupted. The bank won't wait, and Mrs. Garrison said she'd only give us a week. Margaret felt the walls of bureaucracy closing in, threatening to crush their fragile hope before it could take root. There had to be another way, something faster, more direct. What about marriage? She asked suddenly. Pastor Williams blinked in confusion. I'm afraid I don't understand. Thomas and I were supposed to marry. What if we still had that ceremony? I could marry his memory, his legacy, his children. Would that give me legal standing to inherit his debts and responsibilities? The room fell silent as everyone processed this unprecedented suggestion. Pastor Williams frowned, clearly wrestling with theological and legal implications. Miss Sullivan, I've never heard of such a thing. Marriage is a sacrament between two living people. But the intent was there, Margaret pressed. I came here in good faith to marry Thomas Brennan and help raise his children. His death doesn't change my commitment to that purpose. Emma suddenly stood, startling everyone. The girl, who hadn't spoken in weeks, walked to a wooden cabinet and retrieved something from inside, a small velvet box that she placed. Carefully in Margaret's hands, inside lay a simple gold wedding band. Papa Thomas was saving this for you, Emma whispered, her voice hoarse from disuse. He showed it to us. Said when his bride came, he'd finally have a mama to complete our family. Margaret stared at the ring, overwhelmed by the weight of Thomas's hopes and the trust these children were placing in her. She had come to Kansas expecting to marry a stranger for practical reasons. Instead, she was being asked to marry an ideal, a promise, a family's desperate need for survival. There might be another approach, Pastor Williams said slowly, his mind clearly working through possibilities. Common law marriage in Kansas is recognized when there's mutual consent and cohabitation. If you were to take Thomas's name, assume his debts, and live as head of his household, the bank would have to accept me as his legal heir? Possibly. It's unconventional, but not without precedent. Especially if the community supported your claim. Margaret thought of Victoria Garrison's cold calculation, her plan to divide these children like property. Then she looked around the room at 7 faces watching her with desperate hope, and her decision crystallized like frost on glass. Then, that's what we'll do, she said firmly. I'll take the name Margaret Brennan. I'll assume Thomas's debts and responsibilities. And we'll save this farm together. Benjamin's stoic mask finally cracked, revealing the frightened boy beneath. You'd really do that? Take on all of Thomas's troubles just for us? Not just for you, Margaret replied, sliding the wedding ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly, as if Thomas had somehow known her measurements by faith alone. For me too. I came here looking for family, and that's exactly what I found. The next few hours passed in a whirlwind of practical decisions and desperate planning. Margaret sent Pastor Williams back to town with specific instructions. Visit Eugene Hartwell at the bank and explain her intention to assume Thomas's mortgage payments. Purchase additional supplies, winter clothing for the children, basic foodstuffs, materials for urgent farm repairs. Most importantly, spread word throughout Millfield that Margaret Sullivan had become Margaret Brennan, and that the Brennan farm would continue operating under her management. While the pastor handled town business, Margaret faced her first real test as head of the household. The children had been surviving on whatever they could forage or prepare, but evening was approaching, and 7 growing bodies needed proper nutrition. In the farmhouse kitchen, she discovered the extent of their resources. Thomas had been a prudent man. The root cellar contained preserved vegetables, salted meat, and stored grain. But the children had been afraid to use too much, uncertain how long their supplies needed to last. From now on, we eat properly, Margaret announced, rolling up her sleeves. A family needs strength for the work ahead. Emma shyly approached as Margaret began preparing a substantial meal. I know how to make Papa Thomas's cornbread, she offered in her newly recovered voice. I'd love to learn, Margaret replied, and was rewarded with the first genuine smile she'd seen from any of the children. As they worked together in the kitchen, other children gradually joined in. Sarah helped set the table, carefully counting out 7 plates and chairs. The twins brought in firewood without being asked. Even little Ruth contributed by arranging wildflowers in a jar for the table's centerpiece. Only Benjamin remained apart, standing at the window and watching the road with worried eyes. "What are you thinking about?" Margaret asked, moving to stand beside him. "Mrs. Garrison," he said quietly. "She won't like this. She expected us to be grateful for her offer, and now we've chosen a different path. She's not someone you want as an enemy, Miss Margaret. Mr. Garrison owns half the county. They have influence, money, connections." Margaret studied the boy's profile, seeing wisdom beyond his years etched in the worry lines around his eyes. "Are you sorry we're trying this?" Benjamin was quiet for a long moment. "No," he said finally, "but I'm scared. What if we fail? What if you change your mind when things get hard?" The question revealed the core of his fear, not just poverty or hardship, but abandonment. This boy had learned that adults could disappear without warning, leaving children to face the world alone. "Benjamin, look at me." Margaret waited until his eyes met hers. "I'm not going anywhere. When I put on this ring, I made a promise, not just to Thomas's memory, but to all of you. We're going to succeed because failure isn't an option." Dinner that night felt like a celebration, despite their uncertain circumstances. The farmhouse's main room filled with chatter and laughter as 7 children experienced their first sense of security in weeks. Margaret found herself memorizing details, the way Daniel insisted on sitting next to her, how Ruth clapped when she tasted the cornbread, the careful way Emma served everyone before taking food for herself. After the meal, as the children helped clear dishes, Margaret pulled Benjamin aside for a private conversation. "I need to understand our situation completely," she said. "What exactly do we owe the bank, and how much time do we have?" Benjamin retrieved a wooden box from Thomas's desk, filled with papers and receipts. His young face grew serious as he spread documents across the table. "The mortgage is $300, with payments of $25 every 3 months. Thomas missed the September payment, and December's is due in 6 weeks. If we can't pay $50 by Christmas, we lose everything," Margaret finished. "The fall harvest might bring in enough, but it's still in the fields." Thomas was planning to hire help, but after the accident, Benjamin's voice trailed off. Margaret studied the financial records, her heart sinking as she grasped the magnitude of their challenge. $50 was more money than she'd ever seen in one place. The harvest represented their only hope, but bringing in crops required knowledge and manpower they didn't possess. "How much of the harvest is ready now?" she asked. "Most of the corn, probably half the wheat. But it needs to be cut, gathered, threshed, and taken to market before winter weather ruins it. Can we hire workers?" Benjamin shook his head. "All the local men are bringing in their own crops. Nobody has time to work for wages, especially not for us." Margaret felt the enormity of the task settling on her shoulders like a lead blanket. She was a city woman who'd never harvested so much as a kitchen garden. Benjamin was strong and willing, but still just a boy. The other children were too young for heavy farm work. Yet as she looked around the warm farmhouse, listening to the younger children's laughter echoing from the kitchen, Margaret felt her resolve harden rather than crack. "Then we'll do it ourselves," she said simply. Benjamin stared at her. "Miss Margaret, it takes experienced crews weeks to bring in a harvest this size. We're talking about hundreds of acres. Then we'd better start early tomorrow morning." "But you don't understand, Benjamin." Margaret's voice carried quiet authority. "I understand that this seems impossible, but impossible things happen every day when people refuse to give up. Thomas built this farm from nothing. He saved 7 children who had nowhere else to go. Now we're going to save what he built." That night, Margaret lay in Thomas's bed, her bed now, staring at the ceiling and listening to the house settle around her. Through the thin walls, she could hear children's voices, whispered conversations full of hope and lingering fear. Tomorrow would bring the real test. 7 people against hundreds of acres of grain, racing winter weather and their own inexperience. The bank's deadline loomed like a storm cloud, and Victoria Garrison's threat hung over them all. But tonight, for the first time since leaving Boston, Margaret Sullivan Brennan felt she was exactly where she belonged. She had made her choice, declared her intentions, and claimed a family that needed her as desperately as she needed them. Outside, the Kansas wind carried the scent of ripening grain and the promise of frost. Time was running short, but Margaret had faced uncertainty before. Tomorrow, she would learn whether faith and determination could triumph over impossible odds. The gold wedding ring on her finger caught moonlight streaming through the window, a tangible reminder of promises made and responsibilities accepted. Margaret closed her eyes and began planning their salvation, one impossible task at a time. Margaret woke before dawn to the sound of someone moving quietly through the house. She dressed quickly and found Benjamin in the kitchen, building up the fire in the stove with practiced efficiency. Dark circles under his eyes suggested he'd slept as little as she had. "You're up early," she said softly, not wanting to wake the other children. "Harvest waits for no one," he replied, echoing something Thomas had obviously taught him. "If we're really going to do this, we need to start now." Margaret poured water into the coffee pot, her movements careful in the pre-dawn darkness. "Benjamin, I need you to teach me everything. I meant what I said about learning together, but you know things about this farm that I don't." The boy's shoulders relaxed slightly, as if he'd been bracing for her to take charge without consulting him. "Papa Thomas always said the corn tells you when it's ready. The husks turn brown and papery, and the kernels dent when you press them with your thumbnail." As the coffee brewed, Benjamin led her outside with a lantern to examine the nearest cornfield. The stalks towered above Margaret's head, their leaves rustling in the morning breeze. Benjamin demonstrated how to test the ears, and Margaret was surprised to find herself genuinely interested in the practical knowledge. "This section's ready," Benjamin said, marking several rows with broken cornstalks. "But cutting corn by hand is brutal work. Papa Thomas usually hired a crew of 6 men for harvest season. Then we'll have to be creative." Margaret studied the endless rows, her mind racing. "What if we start with smaller sections? Focus on the areas closest to maturity?" By the time the sun crested the horizon, the other children had awakened to find Margaret and Benjamin planning their assault on the harvest. Emma appeared with baby Ruth on her hip, while the twins and Sarah rubbed sleep from their eyes. "We need everyone's help," Margaret announced as they gathered around the breakfast table. "Even the smallest hands can contribute something." Daniel, at 6 years old, puffed out his chest proudly. "I'm strong. I can carry things." Margaret smiled at his eagerness. "I'm counting on that, Daniel. Sarah, you and Ruth can help by collecting any ears that fall. Michael and Matthew, you'll work with Benjamin and me in the cutting. Emma, I need you to coordinate lunch breaks and make sure everyone stays fed and watered." The girl nodded solemnly, seeming to understand the importance of her logistical role. Their first morning in the cornfield was a revelation in both difficulty and determination. Margaret's hands, soft from years of indoor work, blistered within the first hour. The corn knife, a curved blade designed for cutting stalks, felt unwieldy and dangerous. Her back ached from the constant bending and lifting, but she also discovered reserves of strength she hadn't known she possessed. When her arms burned from swinging the knife, she switched to gathering cut stalks. When her legs trembled from crouching, she focused on husking ears while sitting on an overturned bucket. The children worked with focused intensity that spoke to their understanding of what was at stake. Benjamin set a steady pace, cutting stalks with the fluid motion of someone who'd done this before. The twins competed to see who could gather more armloads of corn, turning necessary work into a game. Even little Ruth contributed by sorting ears according to size. Emma moved among them like a general managing troops, distributing water and the biscuits she'd prepared at dawn. Her quiet efficiency reminded Margaret that this girl had been helping Thomas manage household logistics for years. At midday, they paused under the shade of an oak tree that stood at the field's edge. Margaret counted their progress. Approximately 2 acres cleared in one morning. At this rate, it would take them weeks to harvest the corn alone, never mind the wheat and other crops. It's not enough, is it? Sarah asked quietly, her young voice carrying mature understanding. Margaret felt 7 pairs of eyes watching her, waiting for reassurance or honesty. She chose honesty. Not yet, she admitted. But we're learning. Tomorrow will be faster, and the day after that faster still. What if we can't finish in time? Michael asked. Then we'll have tried our best, Margaret replied. But I believe we can do this. I believe in us. That afternoon brought their first real test of unity. As they worked deeper into the cornfield, Ruth grew tired and cranky. Her small voice escalated into wails that could be heard across the prairie. Disrupting everyone's concentration, Margaret saw frustration flash across several children's faces. They understood that every minute mattered, and Ruth's tears were costing them precious time. I'll take her to the house, Emma offered, reaching for her youngest sister. No, Margaret said gently. We're a family now. That means we solve problems together. She lifted Ruth onto her shoulders, corn knife still in hand. Ruth, can you be my lookout? Tell me if you see any birds trying to steal our corn. The little girl's tears stopped immediately, replaced by solemn concentration as she scanned the field from her elevated position. Margaret continued cutting stalks, working more slowly, but keeping Ruth engaged with questions about what she could see. The improvised solution worked. Ruth remained calm. Margaret could continue harvesting, and the other children learned that being part of a family meant no one got left behind. By evening, they had completed nearly 4 acres, double their morning's progress. As they trudged back to the farmhouse, exhausted but proud, Margaret felt the first stirrings of genuine hope. Dinner that night was a celebration of small victories. Emma had prepared a hearty stew from vegetables in Thomas's garden, and Margaret contributed fresh cornbread made from grain they'd harvested themselves. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone. They were literally eating the fruits of their labor. Tell us about Boston, Sarah requested as they lingered around the table. What was it like where you lived before? Margaret described the crowded boarding house, the endless piles of laundry, the grey industrial landscape that stretched as far as the eye could see. As she spoke, she realized how little she missed that old life. Were you lonely there? Emma asked with characteristic perceptiveness. Very lonely, Margaret admitted. I worked with dozens of people every day, but I didn't belong to anyone. Here, even when the work is hard, I feel like I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be. Benjamin, who had been quiet throughout dinner, suddenly spoke up. Papa Thomas used to say that family isn't just about blood. It's about choosing to stick together when things get tough. Smart man, Margaret replied. I think he'd be proud of how hard you're all working. Do you think he can see us? Ruth asked innocently. Margaret felt the weight of that question, understanding that her answer would shape how these children processed their grief and hope. I think love doesn't disappear when someone dies, she said carefully. Thomas loved all of you enough to build this place, to bring you together, to provide for your future. That love is still here in everything he created. The next morning brought unexpected challenges and unexpected help. Margaret woke to find frost covering the ground, winter's first warning that their time was growing short. But she also discovered that Benjamin had been up for hours, sharpening tools and organizing equipment with military precision. I've been thinking about efficiency, he said, as they prepared for their second day of harvest. If we organize ourselves like Papa Thomas did with his hired crews, we can move faster. He had assigned specific roles to each family member, creating an assembly line that maximized everyone's strengths. Margaret found herself impressed by the boys' natural leadership abilities and strategic thinking. The system worked beautifully. By noon, they had matched their previous day's total progress, and by evening they had completed 6 acres. More importantly, they had developed a rhythm, a sense of teamwork that made the grueling work feel manageable. That night, as Margaret helped Ruth and Daniel prepare for bed, She overheard a conversation between the twins that made her heart swell. "Do you think Miss Margaret will really stay?" Michael whispered to his brother. "She's not Miss Margaret anymore," Matthew replied firmly. "She's Mama Margaret. And mamas don't leave." "How do you know?" "Because she put on Papa Thomas's ring. Because she's working harder than any of us. Because when Ruth cried today, she didn't get angry. She found a way to make her feel important instead." Margaret blinked back tears as she tucked Ruth into the small bed Emma had helped prepare. These children were learning to trust again, allowing themselves to hope despite everything they'd lost. The third day brought a visitor that changed everything. Margaret was in the cornfield, teaching Sarah how to properly husk ears, when she spotted a wagon approaching along the farm's main road. She recognized the driver immediately, Jeremiah Walsh from the general store, but he wasn't alone. 3 other men rode alongside his wagon, their faces weathered by years of farm work. "Mrs. Brennan," Walsh called out as he approached. Margaret felt a thrill at hearing herself addressed by her new name. "Heard you folks could use some help with your harvest." The men who climbed down from the wagon introduced themselves as neighboring farmers, James Mitchell, Robert Hayes, and old Henrik Larsen, whose family had immigrated from Norway decades earlier. "We finished our own crops yesterday," Mitchell explained. "Figured we'd lend a hand before the weather turns." Margaret felt overwhelmed by their unexpected generosity. "I don't know what to say." "We can't afford to pay." "Who said anything about paying?" Henrik interrupted in his thick accent. "Thomas Brennan helped every one of us at some point. I'm to return the favor." With experienced help, their progress accelerated dramatically. The men worked with efficient precision, cutting and gathering corn at a pace that amazed Margaret. More importantly, they treated the children as valuable contributors rather than obstacles, teaching techniques and sharing stories that made the grueling work feel like a community celebration. Benjamin bloomed under their attention, his confidence growing as the men recognized his knowledge and work ethic. Emma charmed them with her quiet competence, while the younger children basked in the attention of adults who clearly enjoyed their company. By the end of the week, they had completed the corn harvest and made significant progress on the wheat. More importantly, Margaret had witnessed something remarkable, her makeshift family integrating seamlessly with the broader community, earning respect through their determination and unity, but their growing success hadn't gone unnoticed by everyone. As the farmers prepared to leave that Friday evening, Henrik pulled Margaret aside with a troubled expression. "Be careful, Mrs. Brennan," he said quietly. "Victoria Garrison has been asking questions around town. She's not pleased that you've taken on Thomas's family." "What kind of questions?" "About your background, your qualifications to raise children, your legal right to the property. She's stirring up doubt, suggesting you're taking advantage of the situation." Margaret felt a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn air. Just as they were beginning to build something stable, new threats were emerging from unexpected directions. That night, as she reviewed their financial situation with Benjamin, Margaret realized they had achieved something remarkable in just 1 week. The completed corn harvest would bring in enough money to make their December payment to the bank. They had proven they could work together as a family. They had earned the respect and support of their neighbors, but Victoria Garrison's shadow loomed over their achievements, threatening to undermine everything they'd built. Margaret stared at the farm's account books, numbers swimming before her tired eyes, and wondered what new challenges tomorrow would bring. Outside, the first winter wind howled across the prairie, carrying with it the scent of snow and the promise of harder days ahead. 3 days after Henrik's warning, Margaret discovered the true scope of Victoria Garrison's campaign against their family. She was returning from the market in town, where she'd successfully sold their first wagon load of corn, when she encountered a scene that made her blood run cold. In front of the general store, Victoria stood with 2 well-dressed strangers, a stern woman in a navy dress and a thin man with wire-rimmed spectacles. They were deep in conversation with Pastor Williams, whose face looked increasingly troubled as they spoke. Margaret approached cautiously, catching fragments of their discussion. Completely unfit to care for 7 children, Victoria was saying in her most authoritative tone. She's an unmarried woman with no family, no local connections, no experience with children or farming. Mrs. Garrison raises valid concerns, the woman in navy replied. These arrangements that bypass proper channels often result in tragedy. The children's welfare must be our primary consideration. Pastor Williams spotted Margaret, and his expression grew even more grave. Mrs. Brennan, please join us. I'd like you to meet Miss Caroline Fletcher from the Kansas Department of Child Welfare and Mr. Arthur Pemberton, who represents the county's legal interests. Margaret's heart sank as she understood the implications. Victoria had called in official authorities to challenge her custody of the children. Mrs. Brennan, Miss Fletcher said, her voice crisp and professional, I've been informed of some irregularities regarding your guardianship of the Brennan children. I need to ask you some questions. Of course, Margaret replied, fighting to keep her voice steady despite the panic rising in her chest. First, can you provide documentation of your legal marriage to Thomas Brennan? Thomas died before I arrived. We planned to marry, but so you were never legally married, Mr. Pemberton interjected, making notes in a leather portfolio. On what legal basis are you claiming guardianship? Margaret felt the trap closing around her. In her desperation to save the children, she had acted on emotion rather than law. Now that impulsive decision threatened to destroy everything they'd built. The children needed immediate care, she said carefully. I was already planning to become part of their family. Thomas's death didn't change that commitment, but it did change the legal circumstances, Miss Fletcher replied. Mr. Pemberton, what are the implications? The lawyer adjusted his spectacles with obvious satisfaction. Without legal marriage or formal adoption proceedings, Miss Sullivan has no more right to these children than any stranger. The state has an obligation to place them in properly vetted homes. Victoria stepped forward with false sympathy, which is why I've renewed my offer to take in the younger children. The Garrison household can provide stability, education, and proper moral guidance. What about the older children? Margaret asked, though she dreaded the answer. Benjamin and Emma are old enough for apprenticeships, Miss Fletcher replied briskly. The boy could learn a trade. The girl could train as a domestic. The twins, she consulted her notes. Given their history of behavioral problems, they might benefit from a more structured institutional environment. Margaret felt sick. In bureaucratic language, they were describing the destruction of the family Thomas had so carefully built. 7 children who belonged together would be scattered across Kansas, their bonds severed in the name of proper procedure. I need to see these children immediately, Miss Fletcher continued. Assess their living conditions, interview them individually, determine what arrangements will serve their best interests. When? Margaret asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Tomorrow morning. Please ensure all 7 children are present and available for questioning. That evening, Margaret faced the most difficult conversation of her brief time as the children's guardian. She gathered them in the farmhouse's main room and explained as gently as possible what was happening. The children's reactions were swift and devastating. Ruth began crying immediately, clinging to Emma with desperate intensity. Daniel retreated into himself, sucking his thumb for the first time in days. The twins exchanged looks of grim determination that reminded Margaret how much hardship they'd already endured. But it was Benjamin's response that broke her heart. The boy, who had been growing in confidence, learning to trust again, simply stood and walked out of the house without a word. Margaret found him in the barn, sitting in the darkness with his head in his hands. Benjamin, I knew this would happen, he said without looking up. I knew it was too good to be true. Nobody really wants 7 kids. They just pretend until it gets too hard. That's not true. I want you, all of you. Then why are they taking us away? Margaret sat beside him on a hay bale, choosing her words carefully. Because sometimes the law doesn't understand what family really means. But Benjamin, I need you to listen to me. This isn't over. What can you do? They have papers, officials, authority. You're just one woman. I'm one woman who loves 7 children enough to fight for them. And I'm not fighting alone. This community supports us. Hendrik and the other farmers, Pastor Williams, even Mr. Walsh at the store. People have seen how we work together, how happy you children are here. Benjamin finally looked at her, his young face etched with pain. What if it's not enough? Then we'll deal with whatever comes next. But I promise you this, I will never stop trying to bring this family back together. Even if they separate us temporarily, I will never give up. The next morning dawned grey and cold, with autumn frost coating the windows like a warning. Margaret dressed carefully in her best remaining outfit and made sure the children were clean and properly clothed. She wanted Miss Fletcher to see a well-cared-for family, not desperate orphans. The officials arrived promptly at 9 o'clock, accompanied by Victoria Garrison, who wore an expression of smug satisfaction. Miss Fletcher carried an official-looking folder and began her inspection immediately. Margaret had to admit that the farmhouse would pass any reasonable test. The children's clothing was mended and clean, the house was tidy, and breakfast dishes showed evidence of proper nutrition. Thomas's careful planning and the children's own efforts had created a genuinely comfortable home, but Miss Fletcher seemed determined to find problems. The children are sharing bedrooms, she noted disapprovingly. The younger boy sleeps in the same room as the girls. Daniel has nightmares, Emma explained quietly. He feels safer with Sarah and Ruth nearby. Proper arrangements would provide gender-appropriate sleeping quarters, Miss Fletcher replied. Making notes, she questioned each child individually, and Margaret could only watch helplessly as their carefully built confidence began to crumble under official scrutiny. Sarah became tongue-tied when asked about her daily routine. The twins grew defensive when questioned about their past behavior. Even Emma's newfound voice faltered under Miss Fletcher's clinical attention. It was Ruth who provided the day's most heartbreaking moment. When asked who took care of her, the 3-year-old pointed directly at Margaret and said, "Mama Margaret takes care of me. She sings to me when I'm scared." "This woman is not your mother," Miss Fletcher corrected firmly. "She's a temporary caregiver. Your real family will be people who can properly provide for you." Ruth's face crumpled in confusion and fear. Margaret felt her heart breaking as she watched the little girl struggle to understand why adults were telling her that love wasn't real. The questioning continued for 3 hours, each minute feeling like an eternity. Margaret could see the children withdrawing into themselves, retreating behind the protective walls they'd worked so hard to dismantle. Finally, Miss Fletcher announced her preliminary conclusions. While the children appear physically healthy, the current arrangement is clearly irregular and potentially harmful. I'm recommending immediate placement in approved homes, pending full investigation of Miss Sullivan's background and qualifications. When? Margaret asked, though she could barely form the words. The Garrison family is prepared to take custody of Ruth, Daniel, and Sarah immediately. Transportation has been arranged for Benjamin and Emma to report to their respective placements this afternoon. The twins will be transferred to the Belleville Children's Home tomorrow. Margaret felt the world spinning around her. 24 hours. After everything they'd built, everything they'd shared, the children would be gone in 24 hours. "Please," she said, abandoning pride in favor of desperation. "Give me more time. Let me prove that this family works." "Miss Sullivan," Mr. Pemberton interjected, "your good intentions are obvious, but intention doesn't constitute legal authority. These children need proper homes with properly qualified guardians." Victoria stepped forward with false sympathy. "Margaret, dear, you must see that this is for the best. These children need stability, structure, opportunities you simply cannot provide." Margaret looked around the room at 7 devastated faces, each child processing the destruction of their newfound security in their own way. Ruth clung to Emma, both girls crying silently. Daniel had disappeared entirely into himself. The twins stood like soldiers awaiting execution. Benjamin stared at the floor, his earlier hope completely extinguished. Something inside Margaret snapped. "Get out," she said quietly. Miss Fletcher looked startled. "Excuse me." "I said get out of our home." Margaret's voice grew stronger with each word. "You want to destroy this family? You'll have to come back with legal papers and law enforcement. Until then, these children are staying with me. Miss Sullivan, you're making this much more difficult than necessary, Mr. Pemberton warned. Good. It should be difficult to tear apart a loving family. It should be the hardest thing you ever do. Victoria's mask of sympathy slipped, revealing the cold calculation beneath. Margaret, you're being foolish. You cannot win this fight. All you're doing is making things harder for the children. I'm showing them that someone is willing to fight for them, that they're worth fighting for. After the officials left with promises to return with proper authorization, Margaret gathered the children close. They sat together in the main room, holding each other while autumn wind rattled the windows. What happens now? Sarah whispered. Now we figure out how to prove that families are made by love, not by law, Margaret replied. And we trust that love is stronger than bureaucracy. But even as she spoke those brave words, Margaret felt the weight of impossible odds pressing down on them. She had perhaps 48 hours to find a legal solution that had eluded her for weeks. Victoria Garrison had official backing and unlimited resources. The children's fragile trust was shattering before her eyes, yet as she looked around the room at 7 faces that had become her whole world, Margaret felt her resolve hardening like steel in a forge. Thomas Brennan had saved these children once. Now it was her turn to save them again. The question was whether love and determination could triumph over law and authority. Tomorrow would bring the ultimate test of everything they'd built together. That night, Margaret paced the farmhouse floor until the wooden boards creaked beneath her feet. The children had finally fallen into exhausted sleep, but rest eluded her completely. Every legal option she could imagine seemed to lead to the same dead end. She had no standing, no precedent, no pathway through the bureaucratic maze that threatened to swallow her family whole. At 3 a.m, a soft knock interrupted her frantic planning. Emma appeared in the doorway, still in her nightgown, her eyes red from crying. "Mama Margaret." "I can't sleep." Margaret opened her arms, and the 13-year-old girl collapsed against her, finally allowing herself to be the frightened child she truly was. "I keep thinking about before Papa Thomas found me," Emma whispered. "The cold, the hunger, never knowing if anyone would want me. I can't go back to that feeling." "You won't have to," Margaret promised, though she had no idea how to keep that vow. "But what if the law is stronger than love? What if wanting to be together isn't enough?" The question pierced Margaret to her core because it reflected her own deepest fear. What if everything she'd believed about the power of family was just naive sentiment? What if Victoria Garrison was right, that good intentions couldn't overcome practical realities? "Emma," Margaret said slowly, "do you remember when you stopped talking after Papa Thomas died?" The girl nodded against her shoulder. "What made you start talking again?" "You," Emma replied without hesitation. "When you came, I felt like maybe it was safe to hope again. Like maybe someone would stay. That feeling you had, that hope, that's not something the law can create or destroy. It comes from something deeper than paperwork." Emma pulled back to look at Margaret's face in the dim lamplight. "Do you really believe that?" Margaret met her eyes steadily. "I believe that love makes families, not documents. And I believe that sometimes people have to take extraordinary action to protect what matters most." At dawn, Margaret made a decision that would either save her family or destroy any chance of keeping them together. She dressed carefully, braided her hair with extra care, and pinned Thomas's wedding ring prominently on her left hand. Then she walked to town alone, leaving the children with strict instructions to stay together and trust that she would return. Her destination was not the church or the general store, but the largest house in Millfield, the garrison mansion that sat on a hill overlooking the town like a fortress. If Victoria wanted a confrontation, Margaret would give her one on her own terms. The garrison house was everything the Brennan farmhouse was not: imposing, pristine, designed to impress rather than comfort. A uniformed servant answered Margaret's knock and seemed surprised by her request to speak with Mrs. Garrison. "I'm afraid Mrs. Garrison doesn't receive unannounced visitors," the woman said with barely concealed Disdain, tell her Margaret Brennan is here to discuss the custody arrangements for the 7 children. I believe she'll make an exception. 5 minutes later, Margaret found herself in Victoria's opulent sitting room, surrounded by expensive furniture and paintings that probably cost more than most families earned in a year. Victoria entered wearing an elaborate morning dress, her blonde hair arranged in perfect coils. "Well, this is unexpected," Victoria said, settling into a velvet chair like a queen granting audience. "I assumed you'd be using this time to pack the children's belongings. I came to make you an offer," Margaret said directly. Victoria's eyebrows rose with amused interest. "You make me an offer? My dear girl, you have nothing I want. I have 7 children you're determined to acquire. But I also have something else you want even more. And what might that be?" Margaret took a deep breath, about to gamble everything on her reading of Victoria's character. Public vindication. The satisfaction of being seen as the righteous savior who rescued poor orphans from an unfit guardian. Victoria's smile sharpened. "Go on. You don't really want to raise those children, Victoria. You want to be seen as charitable, generous, morally superior, but actually caring for 7 traumatized children. That's messy, difficult work that doesn't bring social credit, your point? My point is that you could have everything you want without actually taking custody of the children. Public recognition for your generosity, moral authority over those who questioned your motives, and the satisfaction of proving your power." Victoria leaned forward, clearly intrigued, despite herself. "What exactly are you proposing?" Margaret had spent the dark hours before dawn crafting this desperate gambit. "Become our patron. Publicly sponsor our family as an act of Christian charity. Let it be known that the Garrison family is magnanimously supporting Thomas Brennan's orphans in maintaining their home together. In exchange for what? Legal guardianship documents signed by you as our official sponsor. Financial backing for the farm until we're self-sufficient. Public endorsement of our arrangement with the child welfare authorities." Victoria was quiet for a long moment, her calculating mind clearly working through the implications. "And if I refuse? Then you'll get 7 resentful children who know they've been torn from a loving home against their will. Children who will never forgive you for destroying their family. Children who will grow up telling everyone who will listen that Victoria Garrison cares more about control than kindness." The threat was subtle but real. Victoria's social standing depended heavily on her reputation for benevolence. Taking children from a home where they were clearly happy and thriving could backfire spectacularly if those children ever had the opportunity to tell their side of the story. "You're asking me to publicly admit that your arrangement is acceptable," Victoria said slowly. "I'm asking you to be the hero of this story instead of the villain. History will remember Victoria Garrison as the woman who saved Thomas Brennan's children, not the woman who scattered them." Margaret could see the internal battle playing out across Victoria's features. Pride warred with pragmatism. The desire for control fought against the need for public approval. "What guarantees do I have that you won't embarrass me? That these children won't become a public scandal? The same guarantee you'd have with any family, that love and commitment create stability, better than force and fear." Victoria stood and walked to the window overlooking Millfield's main street. From this vantage point, she could see the entire town that looked to her family for leadership and employment. "I would need complete authority over the arrangement," she said finally. "Regular inspections, reports on the children's progress, veto power over major decisions." Margaret felt her heart leap with desperate hope. Victoria was negotiating, which meant she was considering the proposal, agreed within reason. "But the children stay together, and they stay at the farm. And you acknowledge my role publicly? Make it clear that the Garrison family made this arrangement possible." "Gladly. You'll be credited as the benefactor who ensured Thomas Brennan's children could remain together." Victoria turned from the window, her decision made. "Very well. I'll speak with Miss Fletcher and Mr. Pemberton this afternoon. But understand this, Margaret, one misstep, one hint of scandal or impropriety, and this arrangement ends immediately." "Understood." The children will attend church every Sunday. Where the community can see they're being raised properly, they'll participate in town events and represent the Garrison family's values appropriately. Of course, Victoria moved to an ornate desk and began writing on expensive stationery. I'll draft a letter of sponsorship this morning. You'll need Pastor Williams to witness the documents, and we'll need to present a united front to the authorities. Margaret watched Victoria's pen move across the paper, hardly daring to believe that this desperate gambit had actually worked. The children would stay together. They would remain at the farm. Their family would survive. But as relief flooded through her, Margaret also understood the price of this victory. They would live under Victoria's watchful scrutiny, their every action subject to her approval. The children would grow up knowing their security depended on the whims of a woman who saw them as objects rather than individuals. Still, as compromises went, it was far better than the alternative of complete separation. "One more thing," Victoria said without looking up from her writing. "I expect you to marry properly within the year. This arrangement of yours, living as Thomas's widow without actually being his wife, it's irregular and reflects poorly on my sponsorship." Margaret felt her breath catch. "Marry whom? That's your concern. But a proper Christian household requires a proper Christian marriage. Find yourself a suitable husband, or I'll find one for you." The demand hit Margaret like a physical blow. She had fought so hard to keep the children together that she hadn't considered Victoria might require her to surrender her own autonomy as part of the bargain. "Mrs. Garrison, I appreciate your conditions, but I need to make something clear. These children have been hurt by adults who treated them as property to be managed rather than people to be loved. Whatever arrangement we make, their emotional well-being must come first." Victoria looked up from her letter with sharp eyes. "Meaning?" "Meaning that any marriage arrangement must be acceptable to the children as well as to you. They've lost enough father figures. I won't force them to accept another one who might not understand their needs. You're hardly in a position to make demands. Margaret, I'm in a position to walk away from this entire proposal and take my chances with the state authorities. They might separate the children, but at least no one would be pretending it was in their best interests." For a moment, the two women stared at each other across the opulent sitting room, both understanding that they were negotiating for far more than custody of 7 children. They were determining the shape of an entire family's future. Finally, Victoria nodded slowly. "Very well. Any marriage arrangement will require the children's acceptance. But the expectation remains: proper marriage within 1 year, or this sponsorship ends." As Margaret walked back to the farm that afternoon, carrying Victoria's letter of sponsorship in her reticule, she felt the complicated emotions of someone who had won a victory at enormous cost. The children would stay together, but their independence had been traded for security. She found them huddled in the farmhouse kitchen, their faces anxious and afraid. When she explained the arrangement she'd negotiated, their reactions were as complex as her own. Benjamin looked relieved, but troubled. "So we're safe, but we belong to Mrs. Garrison now." "We belong to each other," Margaret corrected firmly. "Mrs. Garrison is our sponsor, not our owner. The difference matters." Emma asked the question that would haunt them all. "What if she changes her mind? Then we'll face that when it happens. But for now, we're together, and we're staying together." Sometimes that's all the security anyone gets. That evening, as official documents were signed and the immediate crisis passed, Margaret tucked Ruth into bed and listened to the little girl's prayers. "Thank you, God, for keeping our family together," Ruth whispered. "And please help Mama Margaret not be scared anymore." Margaret kissed the child's forehead, wondering if Ruth could sense the new fears that had replaced the old ones. They had gained security but lost freedom. They had kept their family intact, but put it under outside control. Still, as she looked around the farmhouse, where 7 children slept safely in their beds, Margaret knew she had made the right choice. Whatever challenges Victoria's sponsorship might bring, they would face them together. The question now was whether love could flourish under scrutiny, and whether a family built on mutual need could survive the pressure of outside expectations. 3 months into their arrangement with Victoria Garrison, Margaret thought they had found their rhythm. The children attended church faithfully, their behavior impeccable under Victoria's watchful eye. The farm operated efficiently, with their successful harvest bringing in enough money to stay current on mortgage payments. Emma had blossomed into a confident young woman. Benjamin was growing into real leadership, and the younger children seemed to have forgotten their earlier trauma. But Margaret should have known that peace under Victoria's patronage would come at a price she hadn't fully anticipated. The crisis began on a bitter February morning when Victoria arrived unannounced at the farm, accompanied by a man Margaret had never seen before. He was perhaps 40 years old, well-dressed, but not ostentatious, with kind eyes and work-hardened hands that suggested practical experience despite his fine clothes. "Margaret, children, I'd like you to meet Samuel Whitmore," Victoria announced as they gathered in the farmhouse parlor. "He's recently purchased land adjoining the Morrison property, with plans to establish a substantial cattle operation." Margaret felt her stomach clench with foreboding. Victoria's tone carried the satisfaction of someone revealing a carefully orchestrated surprise. "Mr. Whitmore is also a widower," Victoria continued, "in need of a wife to help manage his household and future family. I believe you two might find you have much in common." The children exchanged alarmed glances. Benjamin's jaw tightened with barely contained anger, while Emma moved protectively closer to the younger ones. Even Ruth seemed to sense the threat lurking beneath Victoria's pleasant words. Samuel Whitmore appeared uncomfortable with the obvious tension his presence had created. "Mrs. Garrison, perhaps this conversation would be better conducted privately." "Nonsense," Victoria interrupted. "These children are part of any arrangement involving Margaret. They need to understand how their future security will be assured." Margaret found her voice at last. "Mr. Whitmore, I appreciate your visit, but I think there's been some misunderstanding. I wasn't aware that I was available for introduction. Mrs. Garrison led me to believe you were seeking marriage in order to provide stability for the children," Samuel replied carefully. "If I've been misinformed—" "You haven't been misinformed," Victoria said firmly. "Margaret, our agreement specified that you would marry within the year. Mr. Whitmore is an excellent prospect, financially stable, morally upright, with experience managing large households." "He's also a complete stranger," Benjamin interjected, his young voice cracking with emotion. Victoria's eyes flashed with displeasure. "Benjamin, children don't interrupt adult conversations. You do well to remember your place." "Our place is with Mama Margaret," Sarah said quietly, but her words carried surprising strength. "She promised we'd stay together as a family, and you will," Victoria replied smoothly. "Mr. Whitmore has expressed willingness to incorporate the children into his household. You'll have even greater advantages: better education, larger property, enhanced social standing." Margaret watched the children's faces as they processed this information. The fear she saw there, the same terror they'd shown when facing separation months earlier, made her decision crystal clear. "Mrs. Garrison, I need to speak with you privately," Margaret said, her voice carrying quiet authority that brooked no argument. They stepped onto the farmhouse porch, leaving Samuel awkwardly attempting to make conversation with 7 suspicious children. The February wind cut sharp and cold, but Margaret barely noticed. "You can't seriously expect me to marry a man I've never met," Margaret began. "Why not? You came to Kansas to marry Thomas Brennan, whom you'd never met. At least Samuel is alive to consent to the arrangement. That was different. Thomas and I corresponded for months. We had time to develop understanding, shared expectations." "Margaret, you're being sentimental. Marriage is a practical institution, especially for women in your position. Samuel offers security, respectability, and genuine affection for children. What more could you want?" "Love," Margaret said simply. "The children and I have built something real together. I won't risk destroying that for the sake of social convenience." Victoria's expression hardened. "You seem to forget that your something real exists only because of my continued support. Without my sponsorship, those children would be scattered across 3 states by now. Are you threatening to withdraw your support?" "I'm reminding you of reality. Samuel Whitmore is a good man who's made a generous offer. Refusing him would be not only ungrateful, but potentially devastating for those children's future prospects. Margaret felt the familiar weight of impossible choices pressing down on her. But this time something had changed. 3 months of watching the children flourish under genuine love rather than mere duty had strengthened her resolve. "I'll consider Mr. Whitmore's proposal," she said carefully. "But any decision will be made with the children's input and approval. They've earned that right." Victoria's smile was sharp as winter wind. "Of course, dear. But remember, consideration implies an eventual decision. I trust you won't keep Mr. Whitmore waiting indefinitely." That evening, after Samuel had departed with promises to call again soon, Margaret faced the most difficult family meeting since her arrival in Kansas. The children sat around the kitchen table, their faces reflecting the same mixture of fear and determination she'd seen when they first asked her to be their mother. "Are you going to marry him?" Daniel asked bluntly, his 6-year-old directness cutting through adult pretense. "I don't know yet," Margaret answered honestly. "What do you think I should do?" "Send him away," the twins said in unison, their voices fierce with protective instinct. "But what if Mrs. Garrison stops helping us?" Emma asked quietly. "What if refusing means we lose our home again?" Benjamin stood and began pacing, his movements agitated. "This is exactly what I was afraid of. We're not really free. We're just Mrs. Garrison's pets, and she can change the rules whenever she wants." "Maybe Mr. Whitmore is nice," Sarah offered hesitantly. "Maybe he'd really love us like Papa Thomas did." "Papa Thomas chose us," Ruth said with startling clarity for her age. "We didn't get traded to him like horses." Margaret felt her heart breaking as she watched these children grapple with adult complexities that should never have been their burden. They understood with painful clarity that their security depended on her willingness to sacrifice her own autonomy. "What if I talk to Mr. Whitmore?" she said slowly. "Got to know him properly before making any decisions. Would that feel safer to all of you?" Emma nodded thoughtfully. "Like what you and Papa Thomas did with letters. Learning about each other first?" "Exactly like that. No rushed decisions, no pressure from Mrs. Garrison. Just honest conversation about what kind of life we might build together." "And if he doesn't understand us?" Benjamin asked. "If he wants to change how we do things, then we'll know he's not the right person for our family," Margaret replied firmly. Over the following weeks, Samuel Whitmore proved to be both better and more complicated than Margaret had expected. He was genuinely kind, clearly fond of children, and refreshingly honest about his own motivations for seeking marriage. "I won't pretend this is a romantic courtship," he told Margaret during one of their carefully chaperoned conversations. "I need a wife, you need security, and the children need stability. But I believe good marriages can grow from practical foundations." He made genuine efforts to connect with each child individually. He taught Benjamin advanced techniques for managing livestock, helped Emma with mathematics that challenged her quick mind, and showed remarkable patience with the younger children's endless questions about his cattle operation. But Margaret also sensed something that worried her. Samuel approached the children with the kindness of a good employer rather than the fierce protection of a parent. He liked them, but he didn't love them the way Thomas had, the way she did. "He's nice," Emma confided one evening as they prepared dinner together. "But he looks at us like we're part of a business arrangement, not like we're his treasure." Margaret knew exactly what Emma meant. Samuel saw the children as responsibilities to be managed competently, not as individuals to be cherished unconditionally. It wasn't cruelty. It was simply a fundamental difference in how he understood family. The crisis came to a head in late March, when Samuel made his formal proposal during a family dinner. Margaret had expected him to speak with her privately first, but he addressed the entire family as if they were all part of the decision. "I've spoken with Mrs. Garrison about combining our households," he announced. "Margaret and I would marry in May, and you children would come to live at my ranch. There's excellent schooling nearby, and opportunities for all of you to learn valuable skills. What about our farm?" Benjamin asked immediately. The property would be sold, of course. The proceeds could fund your educations or serve as dowries for the girls when they marry. Margaret watched the children's faces as they processed this information. Horror dawned in their expressions as they realized that accepting Samuel meant losing not just their home, but everything Thomas had built for them. "We don't want to leave," Sarah said, her voice small but determined. "Children often resist change," Samuel replied kindly but dismissively. "But you'll find my ranch offers many advantages this small farm cannot provide." "This isn't just any farm," Benjamin said, his voice rising with emotion. "This is our home. Papa Thomas built every board of this house with his own hands. Our memories are here, our family history." "Benjamin, you're being dramatic," Samuel interrupted. "Buildings are just buildings. Family is about people, not places." The dismissal of their attachment to the farm revealed the fundamental gulf between Samuel's practical view of family and the deep emotional bonds that actually held them together. Margaret saw understanding dawn in the children's eyes. This man, however well-intentioned, would never truly comprehend what they meant to each other. "Mr. Whitmore," Margaret said carefully, "I appreciate your proposal and your kindness to the children, but I need more time to consider such a momentous decision." Samuel's expression showed mild frustration. "Margaret, we've been discussing this for weeks. Mrs. Garrison has made her expectations clear. Delay only creates uncertainty for everyone involved." "Then let me remove the uncertainty," Benjamin said, standing with sudden resolve. "We don't want this marriage. We don't want to leave our home or live with someone who thinks our feelings don't matter." "Benjamin!" Margaret warned, but the boy continued. "Mama Margaret, you promised we'd stay together as a family. You promised nobody would make decisions about our lives without asking us first. This man wants to erase everything Papa Thomas built and make us grateful for it." Samuel's face flushed with anger. "Young man, you're speaking far above your station. Children don't make adult decisions." "We're not just children," Emma interrupted, rising to stand beside her brother. "We're a family, and families stick together." One by one, the other children stood, Sarah, Daniel, even little Ruth, forming a protective circle around Margaret. Their message was clear. They would rather face uncertainty together than accept security that required surrendering their bonds to each other. Margaret looked at Samuel's confused face, then at Victoria's cold fury visible through the window where she waited in her carriage. Finally, she looked at 7 children who had chosen love over safety, family over convenience. "Mr. Whitmore," she said quietly, "I'm afraid we must decline your generous proposal. This family belongs together, and we belong here." The confrontation that followed would determine whether love could truly triumph over power, and whether a family built on choice could survive the consequences of defying those who controlled their fate. Victoria's fury was immediate and devastating. She stormed into the farmhouse before Samuel's carriage had even cleared the yard, her face flushed with rage and humiliation. "You foolish, ungrateful woman," she seethed, her carefully maintained composure finally cracking. "Do you have any idea what you've just done? Samuel Whitmore is one of the most eligible men in 3 counties, and you've insulted him in front of these children." Margaret stood her ground, the children clustered protectively behind her. "I've made a decision based on what's best for my family." "Your family?" Victoria's laugh was harsh and bitter. "You have no family. You have 7 orphans who exist at my sufferance, living in a house that survives on my charity." "We have each other," Emma said quietly, but her voice carried across the room with surprising strength. "That's what makes us a family." Victoria whirled on the girl, her eyes blazing. "You will not speak unless spoken to. You're a 13-year-old nobody with no prospects beyond what I choose to provide." "Leave her alone." Benjamin stepped forward, his young shoulders squared with protective fury. "You can threaten us, but you can't make us pretend to be grateful for being treated like property." "Property?" Victoria's voice rose to a shriek. "I have given you everything. Food, shelter, security, opportunities you never would have had otherwise. And this is how you repay my generosity?" Margaret felt the familiar weight of impossible choices, but this time something had fundamentally changed. Watching Victoria's mask slip completely, seeing the cold calculation beneath her supposed charity, she realized that their arrangement had never been about the children's welfare at all. "You're right," Margaret said calmly. "You have given us many things, but you've never given us what we needed most, the freedom to be a real family." "Freedom?" Victoria spat. "Children need guidance, structure, proper moral instruction. They need to understand their place in society and be grateful for the opportunities provided to them. They need to be loved for who they are, not molded into what someone else thinks they should become." Victoria's expression shifted from rage to cold, calculated malice.
"Very well."
"Since you're so determined to reject practical arrangements in favor of sentimental nonsense, let's see how your love survives without my support." She moved to the farmhouse door with dramatic finality. "You have 1 week to vacate this property. My sponsorship is officially withdrawn. Miss Fletcher and Mr. Pemberton will be contacted immediately regarding the children's placement in appropriate homes." "Wait," Margaret called out, her heart hammering with sudden desperation. "Victoria, please. The children have done nothing wrong. If you're angry with me, the children have been corrupted by your influence," Victoria replied coldly. "They've learned to value sentiment over security, defiance over gratitude. They need proper guidance from people who understand their obligations." With that pronouncement, Victoria swept from the farmhouse, leaving behind a silence that felt heavier than winter snow. For several long moments, nobody moved. The children huddled together, processing the magnitude of what had just occurred. They had chosen love over security, and now they faced the consequences: potential separation, uncertain futures, the loss of everything Thomas had built for them. "I'm sorry," Margaret whispered, tears streaming down her face. "I'm so sorry. You were safe, and I've ruined everything." "No," Benjamin said firmly, moving to put his arms around her shoulders. "We made this choice together, all of us, but your children. You shouldn't have had to choose between safety and family." "I should have found another way." "There wasn't another way," Emma interrupted gently. "We couldn't live under her control forever, pretending to be grateful for being treated like dolls in her collection." Margaret looked around at 7 faces that should have been filled with fear and recrimination. Instead, she saw determination, unity, and something that took her breath away: peace. Despite facing an uncertain future, these children seemed relieved to finally be free of Victoria's suffocating patronage. "What do we do now?" Sarah asked practically. Margaret wiped her tears and forced herself to think clearly. "We have a week before Victoria can legally force us to leave. We need to use that time to find alternatives." "What kind of alternatives?" Daniel wanted to know. "Other sponsors, perhaps. Families who might be willing to take us all together. Maybe Pastor Williams knows of possibilities we haven't considered." But even as she spoke, Margaret knew the reality was grim. Few people had resources to support 8 additional family members, and those who did would likely have the same controlling expectations as Victoria. That evening, as the children slept, Margaret sat alone at the kitchen table with Thomas's account books spread before her. Their successful harvest had brought in enough money to cover immediate expenses, but without Victoria's backing, they couldn't hope to manage long-term. The mortgage payments, winter supplies, clothing and shoes for growing children. The financial pressures were overwhelming. She was still calculating impossible numbers when a soft knock came at the door. Margaret opened it to find Pastor Williams standing on the porch, his face grave with concern. "I heard about this afternoon," he said without preamble. "Victoria came to see me. And quite upset." "I imagine she is." Margaret stepped aside to let him enter. "I suppose you're here to convince me I've made a terrible mistake." Pastor Williams settled into a chair by the dying fire, studying Margaret's face carefully. "Actually, I'm here to tell you that you might have more support than you realize." Margaret felt a flicker of hope. "What do you mean?" "Victoria's tantrum this afternoon wasn't as private as she intended. Several people overheard her shouting about ungrateful orphans and proper social obligations. The conversation she had with Samuel Whitmore outside the church was also quite public. And Pastor Williams smiled slightly. And people have opinions about adults who treat children like bargaining chips. Victoria may have wealth and influence, but she's misjudged this community's values. Over the next 3 days, Margaret discovered the truth of Pastor Williams's words. A steady stream of visitors came to the farm. Neighbors, fellow farmers, townspeople who had watched the Brennan family's struggle with growing admiration. Jeremiah Walsh arrived with boxes of supplies and a firm handshake. "That woman thinks she owns this town," he said gruffly. Time she learned otherwise. Henrik Larsson came with 2 of his sons and spent the day reinforcing the barn and mending fences. "This is good land," he said in his thick Norwegian accent. "Good family, too." Should not be lost to one woman's pride. But the most surprising visitor was Eugene Hartwell from the bank. Margaret expected foreclosure notices. Instead, he came with a revised payment schedule that stretched their mortgage over additional years, reducing monthly obligations to manageable levels. "Mrs. Brennan," he said formally, "I've reviewed your account and found your payment history satisfactory. The bank sees no reason to accelerate foreclosure proceedings." Margaret stared at him in amazement. "But without Mrs. Garrison's backing, the bank's relationship is with you, not with Mrs. Garrison. Your harvest proceeds demonstrate the farm's viability. We're satisfied with your management." It wasn't until after he left that Margaret realized what had really happened. The community had quietly rallied around her family, applying pressure through business relationships and social connections. Victoria's withdrawal of support had backfired, revealing her vindictive nature and generating sympathy for the family she'd tried to control. On the 5th day after Victoria's ultimatum, Margaret faced her most difficult test yet. Miss Fletcher returned with official paperwork, prepared to remove the children from what she termed an unstable environment. But this time, Miss Fletcher wasn't alone. Pastor Williams accompanied her, along with Henrik Larsson, Jeremiah Walsh, and 3 other prominent community members. "Miss Fletcher," Pastor Williams said formally, "we're here to provide character references for Mrs. Brennan and testimony regarding the children's welfare." What followed was unlike any bureaucratic proceeding Margaret had ever witnessed. One by one, the community leaders spoke about the family's integration into Millfield's social fabric, their contribution to the town's well-being, and the children's obvious happiness and health. Henrik described Benjamin's work ethic and growing agricultural knowledge. Walsh praised Emma's intelligence and helpfulness in his store. Others testified to the younger children's politeness, curiosity, and clear affection for their guardian. Most powerfully, Pastor Williams spoke about the transformation he'd witnessed. 7 traumatized children becoming confident, loving family members under Margaret's care. "Miss Fletcher," he concluded, "I've been ministering to this community for 20 years. I've seen many family arrangements, both conventional and unconventional. This family works. These children are thriving. Disrupting that success would be criminal." Miss Fletcher listened to the testimonies with growing discomfort. Margaret could see the woman recognizing that removing the children would now be not just controversial, but politically disastrous. The irregularities in Mrs. Brennan's legal status remained concerning. Miss Fletcher said weakly, "Then let's address those irregularities," Pastor Williams replied smoothly. "Mrs. Brennan, would you be willing to undergo formal adoption proceedings for all 7 children?" Margaret's heart leaped. "Of course. But I thought the process was too lengthy and complex, not if the community provides unanimous support and the children consent to the arrangement," Pastor Williams explained. "I took the liberty of researching the requirements." 6 weeks later, on a warm May morning, Margaret stood in the county courthouse with 7 children arranged around her in their best clothes. Judge Morrison, a kindly man in his 60s, smiled down at them from the bench. "This is highly unusual," he admitted. I've never processed 7 adoptions simultaneously, but the community support is unprecedented, and the children's consent is unambiguous. One by one, he asked each child if they wanted Margaret to become their legal mother. 7 clear voices answered yes, without hesitation or doubt. When the final papers were signed, Margaret Brennan became the legal guardian of Benjamin, Emma, Michael, Matthew, Sarah, Daniel, and Ruth Brennan. They were no longer a family by circumstance or charity, but by choice and law. The celebration that evening filled the farmhouse with more joy than it had known since Thomas's time. Neighbors brought food, musicians provided entertainment, and children who had once been scattered orphans danced together in their own home. As the festivities wound down and guests departed, Margaret found herself alone with her children, for the first time as their legal mother. "Are you happy?" Ruth asked, climbing onto Margaret's lap. Margaret looked around the room at 7 faces that had become her whole world. Benjamin, now 16 and growing into genuine leadership. Emma blossoming into a confident young woman. The twins, no longer suspicious but openly affectionate. Sarah, Daniel, and Ruth, secure in the knowledge that they belonged somewhere. "Happier than I ever thought possible," Margaret replied honestly. Emma moved to sit beside her, taking her hand. "Do you ever regret coming to Kansas? Giving up your old life for us?" Margaret considered the question seriously. She had come to Millfield expecting to marry a stranger and build a conventional life. Instead, she had found 7 children who taught her that family was not about blood or legal documents, but about choosing to love unconditionally. "The only thing I regret," Margaret said finally, "is that it took me 26 years to find you." Benjamin stood and moved to the window, looking out at the farm that was truly theirs now. "What do you think Papa Thomas would say if he could see us?" Margaret joined him at the window, her children gathering around her. Outside, spring was painting the Kansas prairie in shades of green and gold. The farm Thomas had built with his own hands stretched toward a horizon filled with infinite possibility. "I think he'd say we turned out exactly as he hoped," Margaret replied. "A real family, choosing each other every day." As the children settled in for the night, Margaret walked through the farmhouse that had become her true home. In the main room, she paused before the mantelpiece, where Thomas's photograph sat beside her adoption papers. "Thank you," she whispered to his image, "for building something worth saving, for gathering children worth fighting for believing that love could triumph over everything else." Outside, the Kansas wind carried the scent of growing crops and the promise of harvest. Inside, 7 children slept secure in the knowledge that they were loved, wanted and permanently together. Margaret Brennan, no longer a mail-order bride, but a mother who had found her calling in the most unexpected way, smiled as she prepared for bed. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new joys, new opportunities to prove that families built on love were stronger than any obstacles the world could offer. The story that had begun with loss and desperation had transformed into something beautiful, a testament to the power of choosing family, the strength found in unity, and the truth that home is not a place, but the people who refuse to let you face the world alone. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.